Blending our early childhood classrooms. All children belong. Before I get started on this presentation today, I just want to review the DEC recommended practices that will be addressed in this webinar. I think 6.3 and 6.6 really summarize what we will be discussing. We want to work to make our classrooms meet the needs of all students. We also want to make sure we're supporting kids through activities, routines, and environments. And we do this by planning and providing the level of support, accommodations, and adaptations needed so each and every child can access the curriculum. In the NAEYC Developmentally Appropriate Practice Position Statement, they stated that we want to create a caring, equitable community of engaged learners in our early childhood classrooms. And how do we do that? We have to uphold the unique value and dignity of each child and family. And to do that, we have to ensure that all children see themselves and their daily experiences, as well as their daily lives of others, within and beyond their community. It needs to be positively reflected in the design and the implementation in our classroom. We also want to recognize each child's unique strengths and support the full inclusion of all children. By doing this, we're going to help children to get to know, recognize, and support one another as valued members of the community. We want to make sure that no one in our classrooms feels invisible or unnoticed or even bullied. And then finally, we have to work to develop trusting relationships with children and to nurture those relationships. To do that, we must embrace children's cultural experiences and the languages and customs that shape their learning. We have to treat each child with respect. So when we talk about diversity, we're talking about and including children with disabilities. Again, within our position statement, NAEYC is telling us to consider the developmental, cultural, and linguistic appropriateness of our learning environment. So how do we do this? We have to be offering meaningful, relevant, and appropriately challenging activities across all interests and abilities. Children of all gender, with and without disabilities, should see themselves in their families, language, and cultures regularly and meaningfully. Remember that the learning environment and its materials reflect what you do and do not value by what is present and what is omitted. So again, we're talking about being developmentally appropriate, but we want to be culturally and linguistically appropriate also. And really important, we do this all day long, but just to remember, we need to scaffold children's learning to achieve meaningful goals. So how do we do that? We have to set challenging but achievable goals for all children. We need to build on children's strengths and their interests to affirm their identities and help them gain new skills, understanding, and vocabulary. And talk about that when we talk about a child's interest, you also could say that that's their obsession, but instead of calling it an obsession, let's use it as a tool for learning, okay? That it's an interest, and if they're interested in it, they're going to want to learn about it, or you can use it as a vehicle for learning. And then finally, we want to recognize and be prepared to provide different levels of support to different children depending on what they need. So how do we do that? For example, some children may need more attention at certain times or support for learning particular concepts or skills. We need to differentiate our support in a strength-based way, and that's the most equitable approach because it helps meet the needs of each and every child. I've included the next few slides to let you know where the idea of inclusion comes from. It's not just from your administration thinking that all children should be in the same class. So what does our law say? Our law, which is IDEA, not only supports equal education opportunities, but specifically it requires schools to support inclusion. And the way that schools can support inclusion is by placing children in the least restrictive environment. So for early childhood,
it's placing children in the same classroom with their regularly developing peers.
Our school code also states that the IEP will have a statement about the special education and related services the child will receive, as well as the program modifications and support. And we are including this because we want to enable the child to be involved in and make progress in the general education curriculum. So I include this to say that the point of any kind of therapy or any additional supports and modifications that we're giving children in our blended classroom is all to help them make progress in the general education curriculum. So, what needs to be in place so that child can be involved and make progress?
So the following slides are straight from your Preschool for All manual, and it says that the goal of the school district is to provide high quality preschool education for all preschool children. So that's again why the least restrictive environment would be to include all children, even including children with disabilities, in our preschool classrooms. And then I highlighted the IEP team process that a PFA classroom is the most appropriate placement for students to receive their early childhood special ed services. So as best as we can, as long as we can provide those supports, all children should be in the early childhood classroom getting the services that they need. Also in the manual, it recommends that at least 10%, but no more than 30% of each classroom enrolled children with disabilities. And the maximum number of students in a classroom should be 20, but the minimum is 15 for blended classrooms. So they're aware that you might need to have less children in a classroom because some children might need more attention. And then again, the number of students funded through the grant should still be served. Students with an IEP should be considered a PFA student. They're active members of the class, so they're considered in the count. Just some final thoughts before we get into the meat of the presentation. The following facts are taken from research compiled by Aaron Barton and Barbara Smith from 2014. And their research supports the benefits and positive outcomes children with and without disabilities can gain from inclusion in regular preschool settings with typically developing peers. And some of the highlights show that inclusion benefits all children with and without disabilities. And children with disabilities can be effectively educated in inclusive programs using specialized instruction. So we're aware that they might need special instruction, materials adapted, curriculum modified. And parents and teachers influence children's value regarding disability. So that's why we have to make sure that everyone is understanding and that everybody is on the same page. Individualized embedded instruction can be used to teach a variety of skills, including those related to early learning standards, and promote participation in inclusive preschool programs to children with and without disabilities. So we can use specific embedded instructions to help children access the curriculum. And families of children with and without disabilities generally had positive views on inclusion. Also, inclusion is not more expensive than having children with disabilities in separate classrooms. And finally, probably the most important piece is children with disabilities do not need to be ready to be included. Programs need to be ready to support all children. So that's really the purpose of this presentation. How do we make sure we are ready to support all children?
So, just a definition of inclusion, just so you have it in your head. Inclusion is the principle that supports the education of children with disabilities alongside their non-disabled peers rather than separately. Both the ADA and Section 504 will require schools and agencies to provide equal education opportunities for children with disabilities. This is law. Ever since Brown versus the Board of Education held that separate was not equal, Inclusion has been part of this requirement to provide equal educational opportunities. But the primary source for the inclusion requirement is the IDEA. Okay, so this is law, this is your definition, this is why we're doing it. But here's a second definition just for inclusion in early childhood specifically. Early childhood inclusion embodies the values, policies, and practices that support the right of every infant and young child and his or her family, regardless of their ability, to participate in a broad range of activities and contexts, and here it is, as full members of family, community, and society. And again, this is from our DEC and NAEYC joint position statement. So all of this introduction that I just shared with you is really to just remember that this isn't coming from your district. This is law. This is written in manuals. This is our guidance from DEC and NAEYC. It is basically best practice, and that's why we're blending. So I really like this next slide. And this is an infographic that was put together that shows us what makes inclusion work. Okay, what are the pieces that makes inclusion work? And we're really going to look at this closer when we, if you watch the second half of this webinar. But the things that we need, the most important thing is your school has to have a vision. They have to have a joint vision and attitude. What is blending going to look like? And in order for it to work, you need all these things around it. So you need administrative support from the top all the way down. You can't be the lone teacher that wants this, okay? You have to work along with families and community. All right, so when you go out, community should know this is what we do in our school. The families should understand what blending, what inclusion means. There has to be collaboration and teaming. And a big thing is transdisciplinary teaming, okay? We want our therapies to happen in the classroom so the child's not pulled. I can now watch the speech pathologist, and now as a classroom teacher, I have 10 more strategies to help that child communicate, even when the speech pathologist isn't in the classroom. Just like you're listening to this today, there have to be multiple opportunities for professional learning. We want to keep our learning going. Do I get frustrated with something? Is there some type of professional learning that I have the opportunity to do to help me make my classroom more successful? Is there formal time to plan? You need to plan as a team. You need to plan individually. Everybody needs to know their roles. Everybody needs to understand the IEP goals that these children have. And then you need time to reflect on that planning. Also, all of this has to be based on evidence-based practice. So some of the information I gave you in the beginning slides are saying, this isn't just being pulled out of my head. So, for example, something called embedded instruction that we're going to discuss in the second part of this webinar. There are evidence-based practices that can help make these children successful and to access the curriculum. And then finally, do you know and what are the adaptations in the support systems that are going to be in place in order to help the children be successful and for you to be successful?
In order for inclusion to be successful, everybody needs to be working together. I talked about transdisciplinary teaming. So it's best practice if the related service people try to, as much as possible, provide their therapy in the classroom. And when we do this, as I stated, there's more opportunities to model for the teacher. So when you're not there, the teacher knows how to support the child. It might be showing a child a placement for speech. It might be making sure that a child is properly positioned in a chair so they have strong trunk support. And also, when you're in the classroom providing therapy, you're able to provide skills that are practiced and are relevant so that child may be successful in the classroom, because we want that child to be an active participant. In order for inclusion to be successful, these three things must be in place. And this is from an excellent article from Young Exceptional Children on a monograph on blending. And they say that all children must have access, they must be able to participate, and they must have the proper support. So having a disability should not limit my ability to access anything that's going on in the classroom, any opportunities or any activities that are going on. I should be able to participate the extent with which children with special needs have meaningful opportunities to engage and to be engaged in classroom activities and routines. So what do you need to change so I can participate and have meaningful opportunities? And then when you're going to change, that's the support that I need. So what kind of curriculum modifications are you going to do? Maybe I can't do exactly what the children are doing, but I can do a part of what they're doing. Or what kind of adaptations can you give me so I can be successful and participate in the classroom? So think about the supports that you're providing your children now. Think about, are all children able to participate in your classroom? And if not, what should you do? And then finally, do all children have access to everything in your classroom? So if the answer is no to these, what can you change in your classroom? What I'd like to do now is to discuss some items or strategies that I know you're probably using in your classroom. But the point that I want to make is, are you using them consistently? And are you using them in different ways for different children? So the first thing I want to discuss is visuals. Visuals teach a child what he or she has to do, and it often will cut down on behavior issues because it's much easier to understand and see than to understand and just hear. Some kids might need visuals all day long. Some kids might need a visual to complete a task, for example, or to learn how to play. So the bottom picture next to the stop sign shows a simple sorting toy that might be at your fine motor table. If a child doesn't know how to play with those 3-4 little baskets, they might take the bin out and just dump the toys. Maybe they'll start throwing the toys or flicking the toys with their finger. But if I have this visual that shows me 3 easy steps how to play with this toy, then maybe I can play appropriately. You could have one of these little visual cards in every basket, and the kids that need the visual will use the visual. Or you can teach all kids to use the visual. The kids that don't need the visual will stop using it, but the kids that still need it will continue to use that visual. I put the picture of the stop sign up because sometimes just having a visual rather than pairing it with words is much more effective to get a child to not do something that we don't want them to do. I know many of you wear little visuals on a lanyard, for example, so just hold up the stop card instead of saying, stop, don't run, stop, don't do that. Everybody knows what a universal stop sign is. The other thing, I'm going to go into schedules, but some children need a visual schedule of their own, or they might need a visual schedule to get through an activity. So maybe you give me on just a little piece of cardboard the 5 things that we do during circle time. And every time one of those activities during circle is over, I rip it off and I put it in a little envelope that says stop. That lets me know that there's 3 more activities before circle time is over. So think about, how are you using visuals consistently in your classroom?
I started talking about schedules because schedules are a type of visual. But a visual schedule for a child communicates the sequence of upcoming activities or events through the use of objects, photographs, icons, words, or a combination. So if you have a child that isn't paying attention to your visual schedule, you need to look. Maybe that child needs to have an individual schedule, as I have some posted, those different colorful ones, Or maybe they need to carry an object from one activity to another to indicate that that schedule is changing. And in our next webinar, if you watch the follow-up to this, I'm going to talk about sort of the hierarchy there are to schedules. That sometimes when teachers say that a child doesn't pay attention to the schedule, either they don't understand the visual that is up there, or the teacher is not consistently using the schedule. So again, remember, a visual schedule tells me where I should be and when I should be there. They're very, very important. All young children can't sit too long, so you need to take a look at how long you're asking your children to sit. When you look at your visual schedule, are there movement breaks in your schedules? This schedule makes my classroom predictable for me, and we all know that young children like predictability, as do adults. So do you have a way with your schedule to indicate that an activity is over? So when that activity is over, do you turn the picture over? Do you move a paper clip down? Do you put it in all done? Somehow you need to have an indication of that. Another very important thing that we have to have in our classroom is clear transitions. A child should never need to wait more than 3 minutes, right? That's what our Eckers manual says. So how am I indicating that a transition is happening in my classroom? One thing we want to look at in our classroom is, do you have too many transitions? Are we constantly asking young children to transition from activity to activity? Make sure, as I just said, they're not spending too much time waiting. Children can't wait long, and if you make me wait, I'm only going to get in trouble or start doing something I'm not supposed to. Have you given me unclear expectations in the transition? So here in the top left, you can see I have a picture of a time timer. When I tell a young child you only have 5 minutes left, that means absolutely nothing. But this time timer, and there's other timers out there like this, visually shows me the time clicking away. As what I can say to the child, look, 5 minutes is almost over. There is barely any red left. Okay, I also can help a child transition. Here are these little pictures of the feet. I can show a child, you're standing on number 7, purple number 7, and then they go to the line and they stand on number 7. That's a clear transition instead of just saying, go line up. Maybe in the beginning of the year, I need this. So that's an example of giving an oral direction with no clues. But if I say, go stand on purple 7, and I show them a little picture of it, it's easier to find it. If your schedule seems to be out of control, take a look at your transitions. Try to minimize your transitions. That's right out of the pyramid model. Some other things from the pyramid model is know what the staff will do with that. Who's going to greet the child? Who will begin to sing to them when they're in line? Who's going to do the rhyming activity, and who's going to wait with the children as they start to line up if you have more than one person in your classroom? And then again, minimizing transitions. And again, this is something that Eckers has us look at. They don't want kids waiting in line. So I think we've all learned now that usually it's better not to have all kids line up at the same time to go to the bathroom, because then I have kids waiting in line. I know sometimes we have to do that, but if I'm waiting in line, what can you do to make that transition easier for me? So are you practicing nursery rhymes with me? Are we singing the alphabet song? Are we doing a movement? So again, you're looking at these things. How are you using them in your classroom? How are you consistently using visuals? How are you consistently using a schedule in your classroom? How are you consistently using clear transitions and not a lot of transitions for your children? The next thing is, I'm a speech pathologist, so this is sort of my soapbox. How can children communicate in your classroom if they're unable to speak? So my pet peeve is when I see a child given a communication board during circle time or large groups so they can participate, but then it's put away when circle time is over. If I can't communicate verbally, I need a way to communicate with my classmates all day long, not just during circle time. So again, as a classroom teacher, you might not be trained in all the different communication systems that are out there. So you need to, just back to that infographic, you need to be working along and teaming with your speech pathologist and asking them to help you set up a system. And there's many easy systems, okay? The one picture of the boy with the binder, that's the PECS system, which I'm sure many of you know. The reason that PECS is such a nice and used often and a nice system is a child's not just pointing to a picture. They have to pick up that picture and give it to you. So just like when I communicate, I have eye contact and I'm talking to you. If I have a picture and I have to get your attention to give you the picture, I am communicating with you. I'm not just pointing to a picture. So think about it. Do all children in your classroom have a way to communicate? Can they communicate all day long? Is their system portable? Is it understood by all? So if you have a child that is using sign in your classroom, are you going to teach the other children in the classroom some basic signs? Okay, so think about communication. And then, as I said earlier, we have young children. Young children are understanding. Parents of young children are understanding. We need to discuss differences in our classrooms. And NAEYC asks us to do this and tells us to do that. We're all different and we're different in different ways, okay? And it's, as that one book says, it's okay to be different. So not every book has to talk about differences and disabilities. We want to, in general, talk about differences. But then if there is one child with Down syndrome, yes, you want to find a book about Down syndrome and let children ask questions. My daughter always talked about that I was very natural. If we saw someone in a wheelchair, I wouldn't move her away. I would stop and I would let her ask questions and I would make sure that we said hi to that other child. And both of my children, because I made differences a very natural thing in my home, both of my kids were very accepting at a young age. I'm not tooting my horn. All I'm saying is I discuss differences with them and I let them ask me questions. So if you're blending and you have one child in a wheelchair, you need to discuss with the other children why he uses that wheelchair. Let them ask questions. Let them sit in the wheelchair. I'm sure you do this, but this again is just to be conscious about these things. And are we doing it consistently? Okay? Because maybe now in your classroom, everybody communicates by speaking. But maybe come November, you're going to have a child that's nonverbal, okay? Explain to the children why he's using that machine to talk. Don't just have him start using it. By explaining differences to children, not only are they more accepting, but it just becomes a natural part of your classroom. So again, take a minute and think about, are you giving children the opportunity to ask about the differences in the classroom and about different children? And how are you going to handle it? The other thing I want to say is there are tons of books out there now about different disabilities, but read them first because many books are not written for children in early childhood. So you want to make sure it's simple enough for them to understand and that it's a good book.
A big part of making sure that our children can be active members of the classroom is at times adapting the environment or the materials so they can be fully participating in all activities. So I just like what this slide says. Adapting materials in the classroom allows the student to participate fully, right? We don't want our children sitting doing their own thing. We want them participating. So part of that infographic that I showed you talked about adapting and modifying the material. So this isn't a commercial, but two wonderful books that we have in the StarNet library. but you can get all over, are Kara's Kits and Building Blocks. And the reason I like these two books is they're specifically written for early childhood, and they look at the activities that we do in our classroom, and they say, here's a continuum of adaptations. Look at the different ways that you can adapt during circle time or during playtime when a child can't participate or is roaming from center to center. Here are some adaptations you can do to help a child fully participate. Both books that I mentioned look at a continuum for adaptations. In Kara's Kit, they call it a hierarchy of adaptations, and they say it's from least restrictive to most restrictive. So of course we always want to try the least restrictive adaptation first, and that would be looking at the environment. What can you change in the environment so the child can be more successful? So it could be as simple as making wider entrances into your play centers because you have a child in a wheelchair. And remember, just like visuals, we have to teach how to use an adaptation. So if it's something to the environment, maybe you don't need to teach that per se. But if it's different materials, maybe you need to point that out and show the child how they use the material, how they use this special scissor. Most of these adaptation types are self-explanatory, but I did want to explain just a few in the right-hand side. Child preference would be, what is something that the child really likes? Maybe by taking something that I like, you can get my attention and you can get me to focus and to do something that maybe I wouldn't do. So for example, if I like trains, in the dramatic play, you might add a conductor hat and vest, and maybe that would draw me to come to dramatic play, and you could teach me a little script of how to play conductor, and then maybe the conductor has to make lunch, so all of a sudden now the child is doing something that they wouldn't normally have done. Or I don't often go to the science center and you would like me to vote on a science experiment. You have something about trains in the science center, and then you guide me to the other activity that's there. But because you started with something that I'm interested in, I might be more apt to do the thing that I'm not as highly interested in. The other point that I want to make is the invisible support. An invisible support, you purposely arrange naturally occurring events within an activity. So for an example, I once saw a video of a little boy with autism, and they were on the playground, and he was just walking in circles. He wasn't playing with anyone. He wasn't playing with any toys. And there were children riding tricycles. And what one of the teachers did is she gently kicked one of the tricycle in the middle of the boy's path as he was making his circle. And then all of a sudden, this boy sat right down on the tricycle and started to play. So on his own, he wouldn't go get the bike. But when it was put right in front of him in a natural way, he rode the bike and he was fine and he joined in with his peers. If frustrated with a child, look at the type of support you're providing. Maybe it's not the right. Maybe you're too far down on the continuum and you need to back up a bit. One of the most frustrating things, I think, for many teachers when we start including children is the behaviors that occur. But what I want you to look at is this picture, which I think really, really helps us get to the root of what the behavior is. This is the iceberg. And if you think of an iceberg, the top of the iceberg is all we see when we're in the ocean. That's the behavior. But we need to go below to the bottom of the iceberg and look what is causing that behavior. All behavior has meaning, okay? So many times the children in your class, when they're acting out, are trying to tell you something. So you need to take a close look. Do they need a visual because verbally they don't understand what I'm telling them to do? Have there been too many transitions and now the child is so confused with the schedule? Is it late in the afternoon and the child is getting tired? So all they know how to do is have a tantrum right before they go to the bus? Is it that I'm giving them too many directions to get ready to go on the bus and they don't understand what to do? So look at when a child has a tantrum. Try to see what could be causing that meltdown, that misbehavior. Many, many times you'll see a pattern. So if it happens at the same time every day, what happens before that behavior? If it happens during circle time, is it the child that they're sitting next to? Sometimes it could be a scent. Is it the assistant that's rubbing my back and I only like deep pressure and they're giving me light pressure? So instead of looking at the child as that they're trying to ruin your day, I want you to think of this visual. You only see the tip of the iceberg. You need to be a detective and get to the bottom of the iceberg and see what is causing that misbehavior.
So it's our job to figure out why that child is acting out, okay? You need to stop the meltdown before it happens. Once the child is on the floor or screaming or crying, negotiation doesn't happen, okay? Again, you need to be that detective. You need to figure out before the meltdown happens. I know it's not easy, but if we look back on some of the supports we should begin giving kids consistently, sometimes maybe we can figure out what happened right before that meltdown. There often is a pattern. Instead of just telling a child to stop or to say no, tell the child what you want them to do, okay? Instead of don't run, we walk down the hall. Instead of don't throw the block, can you give the block to whoever? And then take a look at your environment. What could you change in the environment, the activity, the materials, the instruction to help that child get in control? Okay? So, do I need a break? We all have our cozy corners. Why do we have our cozy corners? So I can get in control, right? It's not a timeout. So I can get my body in control. What can I change in the environment? Was this activity too high for the child? Was it unclear for the child? Does the child need to learn in a different mode? So try to shift your viewpoint of behavior and that the kids in your classroom are just acting out and you can't teach. There's probably a reason that they're acting out. So what can you change so that child can be successful? So you can understand what's below that iceberg, that you're not just seeing the behavior.
And in conclusion for this webinar, I want to end with a quotation from First Steps to Preschool Inclusion, which we also have in the StarNet library. And they say, when children are exposed to inclusion from an early age, they're more likely to approach children with disabilities with acceptance. That's all we want. We want children to be accepted, valued, supported. We want a community. We want accommodations to come naturally. And we want our classrooms to be diverse. But we want that diversity to be reflected in our classroom with everyone being accepted. Thank you. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to contact StarNet Region 6.
I want you to think about an action plan. From the things that we discussed in this webinar today, what's a change you could make tomorrow? What's something you could go into your classroom tomorrow or Monday and simply change? Is there something in the environment? Do you need to just move your schedule? Do you need to take a look at your schedule and make sure you have clear transitions? And then what's something that you'd like to change as a group? So going back to that infographic, as your team, as the early childhood team in your school, or the resource specialist that the OTPT related services that you work with, as a team, what's something that you could change? And then finally, think about, we're at the beginning of this year, but maybe things really have to take a big shift in the district or the program that you work at. Maybe you say you're blending, but you're really missing a lot of pieces of blending. Is there a big picture that maybe you need to change for next year? So I hope that you will make some changes in your classroom. I hope that you'll go back and look at these basic things that most of us use in early childhood and make sure that you're using them consistently so all children can be successful in your classroom. Have a nice day.